We have gathered in this moment today because someone we love and respect has died. Our lives and minds have been broadened by Wilbur McFadden. His life was an expanding map of places and ideas, abilities and wonder. His life was a lived library of interests with space on the shelves for more. His life was a foundation of love and commitment to the whole community and to each individual within. His service upheld his belief in the human capacity to grow and to realize the potential we hold within us. There is a way that Wilbur held his body. His body leaned forward and rounded from the shoulders into the conversation, leading with a face full of sparkle and interest and eagerness in his eyes to explore what he had yet to know. A smile that welcomed all into the conversation of thought that was going on inside him at all times about many things all at once. And we will miss this. We will miss Wilbur. And so you are all welcome here to bring all of your grief to this space that is prepared for our tears and joy, our loss and our deepest appreciations. We will comfort each other with story, and we may learn something new from his life that becomes a nudge in our life toward a new way of understanding and being. God is with us here as a mystery too grand to be known completely and so tenderly near within the beating of our own hearts. Please pray with me. O creating, imagining God, you envisioned and fashioned veins to carry the lifeblood that serves the heartbeat of human possibility. You set quasars and black holes into the physics of the universe. You urge us to know that the greatest of things come from the tiniest of seeds. Meet us now as we celebrate the life of Wilbur McFadden. You handcrafted a heart for service and care into Wilbur's own being. You filled him with a verve and a pace for learning and living that few could keep up with. And you gifted him with agency to explore his own fullest sense of ideas and wonder. The most sacred of gifts is a life well lived, and it's what we've gathered to celebrate. Bless every emotion that we carry within us this day as we hold dear memories that are ours to relish and return to. In the name of Jesus, whose way creates far more and greater still when we are gathered together in curious hope and honest care for one another. Amen.
We will be singing hymn number 307. 307.
Thank you. I'm Tim, and I wanted to say a few words about my dad as a doctor. And before I start, I wanted to ask, how many of you had the experience of him serving you when he was in the role of a doctor? That's terrific. Me too. And I'm a doctor also, and he was by far the biggest influence in my decision to go into medicine. And my first memory of Dad as a doctor was when I was 5 or 6 years old, and he let David and I watch surgery in the operating room in Indonesia. And I remember there was a table that seemed really high, and there was a person on the table and a white sheet that draped the person. And above that, there was the brightest light I had ever seen in my life. And Dad, he was wearing this funny hat and mask, and he got to work. And I remember all of a sudden there was a big splash of blood that came out and splashed down on the sheet. And then he got back to work and he reached under the sheet and he pulled out a baby. It was like a magic trick. And it must have made a big influence on me because I can never remember wanting to be anything else besides a doctor. And the first time I actually got to work with him was when I was in college, and I was an orderly in the Wabash Hospital emergency room. And back in those days, believe it or not, there was not a doctor in the emergency room all the time. So the orderly and the nurses, we would prep the patient, and then we would call who was ever on call for that person in their practice. And so every doctor had a different style, and it was a great education for me because I got to work with all the doctors in Wabash County. So every doctor had a calling card. Like one of them was very gentlemanly and kind, and one was very demanding and impatient, and one of them was really slow and ponderous. And Dad had his own style too. I would say he was efficient and fun. He would breeze into the room, and assuming the patient wasn't in dire straits, he'd start with a few lighthearted comments, he'd get down to work early, and then he almost always finished with a joke about the nurses. Or if I was there, it was a crack about me. But he was positive, even if the case didn't go perfectly. I have some other adjectives about him as a doctor. First, he was dedicated. For years, he made medical calls at home, he made house calls, he saw patients in the clinic in the evenings or the weekends, and he was on call to do C-sections all the time. It was just a way of life. And even if we were at Christmas time sitting ready to open Christmas presents, he might get a call for a delivery and he'd say, "I gotta go, I got an OB," and off he would go. No complaints and no apologies. I think I was a teenager before I figured out OB did not stand for overdue baby. But the point is, medicine was a calling for him. And also, he was bold. As soon as he finished his training, he went into Puerto Rico in the mission field in Indonesia. And it's amazing to me to think that he was only 30 years old when he started that training. I remember around that time in my life, I was about 30 years old, and it dawned on me, we were talking about him doing a thyroidectomy on a person in Indonesia who had a very large tumor. And it dawned on me that he wouldn't have been trained to do thyroid surgery in a general surgery rotation. And I said, wait, how did you know how to do that? And he smiled a Wilbur smile, and he said, well, I read the book. And what he explained was he did what he needed to do to meet the need. And he met the need in his career in a variety of ways. He was a general practitioner and a pediatrician, a general surgeon, an obstetrician and gynecologist, and an addictionist. They don't make doctors like him anymore. A couple of other adjectives come to mind. One is that he was pretty clumsy. He even used that word to describe himself sometimes. And I have a cousin who had a hair-raising story about him trying to pierce her ears. And I don't know if any of the cousins can relate to that or not. But I remember when I was about 15 years old and we went fishing, and he had bought this little rowboat, and we went out to Lucan's Lake. And he banged around in the boat. I bet he scared every fish within a quarter mile. And then he was trying to tie the fishing line onto his daredevil lure. And he tied it up and down and this way and that. And by the time he got done, the knot was about a quarter as big as the lure was. And I remember thinking, if any of his patients could see him right now, I don't think they would let him do surgery ever again. He was also goofy. I think his highest medical principle was never let bad taste get in the way of a good joke. And that was followed closely by, why tell a joke once when you can tell a joke 20 times? Like, he played practical jokes on friends sometimes, even before intimate procedures. There was one time he actually put 2 bricks on the instrument table and covered them with a towel when he did a vasectomy for a friend. We have a friend at church in Elkhart named Kathy Barwick, and she's a nurse, and she worked at the clinic in the 1970s. And she sent me a note. She said, we laughed so much during the day, at times it didn't feel like work. His lightheartedness helped us get through the long hours and sometimes dark days. When other colleagues have talked to me, they almost always remember his playfulness. And I think he might have been his truest self when he was telling a joke. He was also inquisitive, especially about other people. And if it wasn't telling a joke, then maybe he was his truest self when he was asking somebody questions about what made them tick. He did a program at the Shepherd Center in Manchester called Med Talk for about 20 years. And Med Talk was where he would get together with somebody in the health professions and he'd ask them questions for an hour. And I remember one time he told me with a smile on his face, he said more than half of the reason he did Med Talk was he just loved asking people about what excited them about medicine. Like he was getting away with something or something for doing that, for doing the Med Talk. He also really liked asking people questions on a personal level. And I have a friend, David Dieter, who lived in Manchester for a year when his mother was at the end of her life. And he told me he would challenge me, test my logic. He was always engaged and interested and supportive when needed. And I think that sums it up pretty well. Finally, he was grateful. When we would talk about his medical work, he would always mention how much he loved his patients and his colleagues. The one request he had for me for his funeral was to thank all of his former patients and the people that he worked with. He used to tell me over and over, the Manchester clinic was non-toxic. I don't know if he ever told you that, but he meant it in the best way. He said people worked hard and they didn't complain. And he said the care at the clinic and the hospital was really, really good. I remember it was in 2011, 2 or 3 days after my mom died, and he had a GI bleed, and he ended up in the hospital at Wabash. And Rosanna and I went down to visit him. And the first thing he said when we came in the room, he said, "Tim." I said, "What?" He said, "I am so lucky to be here in Wabash because the nurses know me and I know they're going to take good care of me." And I thought, yeah, you are so lucky to be in the hospital. But that was a quality about him that I think I respected the most, is he was resilient. He had all kinds of challenges at the end of his life and transitions because his health was declining and he didn't have the same kind of independence. But he sailed straight into every transition, and he didn't complain, and he made the best of every situation. He was very clear-eyed about the end of life and about death. And I told him he was 90 years old and he was still teaching me about life. As a doctor and a father, he led by example. And I think his example was exemplary. And he was also just a really good guy. And I will miss him a lot.
There. I'm Joy, the youngest McFadden sibling, and I'm also the one with the most hair. I will be sharing with you a moment in my life when my identity as a McFadden ties into my relationship with my dad. In the summer of 1999, both of my parents approached me and shared that they would like to know more about my birth family, which included my birth grandmother and my birth father. And they wanted to know if I was interested. So we'll fast forward to February of 2000. I was interested. We went to Indonesia. After an emotional time of meeting my birth family, I had went to my dad and asked him if he was okay with me meeting my birth father. And my dad replied, "Absolutely, because you'll always be my daughter." It was confirmed for me right then and there that he is my forever dad. And I am a McFadden. My dad is the one who raised me and the one who gave me the values that I continue to live out today. I miss him very much.
Over the last years of my dad's life, we talked often about this service and this eulogy. "When you give my eulogy, David," there was never a question, "when you give my eulogy, David," he would say, "I want people to know that I'm curious." I warned him that that statement could be taken in a variety of ways, but he insisted. So, this. My father was a curious man. Dad was indeed curious about many things. He often said, for example, that he would like to know what killed him. He didn't want to linger or suffer, but he also didn't want to die so quickly that he missed out on knowing his cause of death. One of the first questions Sam asked when I called with the news that Dad died was, "Did Grandpa know what he died of?" We don't know one way or the other. Because he died fairly suddenly, I'd like to think that his physician mind was able to register his symptoms and determine his likely cause of death in his last moments. Wanting to know what kills you. My dad was a curious man. Dad loved big questions, whether they were about science or history or society. He and several friends enjoyed teaching the Quester Sunday school class from time to time, and I was always impressed by the topics that they chose. One time it was quantum physics, and another time the evolution of thinking about and the sources of human consciousness. I told him when I heard about quantum physics, Dad, you don't know anything about quantum physics. And he said, yes, but I've read some books. The books by Dad's recliner and on his bookshelf revealed a lot about the breadth of his interests. He had books about bridges and Ernest Shackleton, the polar explorer, books about human mortality and contemporary social issues. Dad had a half dozen or more books about epidemics, including the Spanish flu, smallpox, and COVID-19. During the pandemic, he wrote weekly updates for Timbercrest residents covering everything from historical responses to global-scale pandemics to the science behind the virus and vaccines. Dad didn't read novels or other fiction, saying he didn't have time for things that weren't real. This changed late in his life when he began reading trashy romance novels that Mackenzie would loan him. I remember him sending one back once saying it wasn't trashy enough. If you looked around my dad's room, you would also find evidence of another great passion, trying to outsmart the world around him. Hacking life is what Tim called it. We used to say that he could have been MacIver. Do you remember MacIver, the TV hero, who could make something out of nothing and get out of a jam? Well, when Dad had trouble feeling his feet because of neuropathy, he put on 5-pound ankle weights so he could tell where his feet were, he said. When he had trouble swallowing, he took to eating standing by the stove so that gravity would help the food go down. When one of his toes rubbed inside his shoe, he simply cut a hole in the shoe to accommodate it. Rachel remembers finding a piece of heavy black thread wrapped around a piece of fried chicken that Dad had prepared. Dad knew that fried chicken is supposed to have the skin on, and so when it was starting to come off, he simply tied it back on. By the way, don't try these at home. And Dad loved Velcro. He had Velcro on half a dozen grabbers, on his phone, his TV remote, his walker, his scooter, and his recliner. If you could put Velcro on it, he would. When we packed up his room after he died, we found a 6-foot roll of Velcro in one of his drawers. A couple of weeks ago, all of Dad's descendants gathered for a week in Florida. It was a long-planned family vacation, and Dad was intending to go with us. While we missed him, we took the opportunity to celebrate his life and did so by telling Wilbur stories. In the end, almost all of them were about his sense of humor and the funny things that he did. Dan remembers once in Indonesia when we stopped by the side of the road to buy some fruit. We were driving a Volkswagen Beetle with a trunk in front and the engine in the back. When Dad opened the trunk to put the fruit in, the Indonesians who had gathered around were amazed that there was no engine. Without missing a beat, Dad put the fruit in the trunk, closed the trunk door, said, "It runs on fruit," and we drove away. One of the enduring traditions in our family was hiding Easter baskets. Dad thought it was hysterical to hide them in impossible to find places. For example, he once hid one in the furnace behind the filter. In the furnace behind the filter. He hid one in the dust bag of our vacuum cleaner. And another time, he hid a small Easter basket for Wendy underneath an end table where the drawer ends and the end of the end table. He taped it there so it couldn't be seen. He opened a full case of paper towels that we had in the basement, removed a roll of paper towels, inserted an Easter basket, and re-glued the box shut. My folks visited us, Renee and me, when we were living in Laverne for Christmas one year. 4 months later, on Easter Sunday, he called to say that he had hid an Easter basket for me. I tore the house apart, couldn't find it, and when I conceded defeat by calling, which delighted him to no end, he pointed me to the bookcase, where he had taken a book, hollowed it out, and placed a miniature Easter basket, and replaced the book on the shelf. I could go on and on about Easter baskets. Dad made a habit of giving stacks of $1 coins to his grandkids for Christmas and birthdays. It was a nice gift, except he would put them inside rubber gloves or Dixie cups, fill them with water, and freeze them. Once on his granddaughter Becca's birthday, he blew out the candles on her birthday cake just as everyone finished singing Happy Birthday. They relit the candles, and he did it again. And he did it a third time. Becca was 6 years old. Because he was a doctor, Dad filled out our health forms when we went to camp. One year he wrote that I was allergic to girls and mowing the lawn, and that Tim needed a girlfriend. That last part, by the way, was true. Our dad was a curious man. Dad was also a generous man. Some of his generosity was public, such as the gift that he gave the university that resulted in the eating venue in the library being named Wilbur's. Some of his giving was more private. Dad and Mom imagined one time that they would spend a year in Brethren volunteer service, but Dad knew that he could serve more people in more effective ways by continuing his work. And so they chose to give 90% of his salary to the church for a year and live frugally the way a Brethren volunteer service worker would. I told you earlier about Dad reading trashy romance novels. Tim told me recently that Dad confided to him that he really didn't like them, and he didn't really even read them, but he liked the connection that he had with Mackenzie because of them. Connecting with people was one of Dad's passions in life. He loved his colleagues and patients and missed them tremendously after he retired. Joy remembers him taking an intentional and genuine interest in her friends when she was growing up. And Dad and Mom had a multitude of enduring friendships through their experience with Alcoholics Anonymous. His investment in relationships was never more evident than in his last years at Timbercrest. Dad moved into the manor soon after Mom died and immediately began inviting small groups of people over for dinner. Once dinner became too difficult to prepare, he made fruit cobblers and invited friends to come to dessert. He told me he didn't do it for the meals or the cobbler, he did it for the conversations that he had with those guests. And always, he liked inviting people over to see his Z-gauge train set. The most important relationship for Dad was the one that he had with Mom. She spent many years of her life ill and addicted to painkillers and alcohol. He was a loving caregiver during those times, a rock-solid supporter during her recovery and years of sobriety, and with her, a passionate advocate for others in recovery. You should know that Dad set aside some of Mom's cremains and asked that they be commingled with his. It reflected their deep and abiding love for each other. There are two things I'd like to share quickly before I close. First, you'll notice that some of us are wearing batik today. Batik is frequently worn in Indonesia on formal occasions, and we wear it today to honor Mom and Dad's service there. And second, Dad specifically asked that the violin composition Ashokan Farewell be played during his memorial service. He first heard it in a Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War and was deeply moved by the music. My dad wanted you to know today that he was curious about the world around him. We also know today that he was loved and will be missed very much by all of us. Thank you for being here.
I'm reading from the book of Proverbs, the very beginning of it, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young, and let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill, to understand a proverb, a figure, the words of the wise, and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What an amazing thing it is to have known Wilbur. As father and grandfather, and one day his legendary thirst for knowledge and deep love for family will be known by the great-grandkids. He is known by you, his patients, the babies that he brought into the world, the people that he worked with, friends, Timbercrest staff at every level, church family, Sunday school thinkers and seekers. He was known. Proverbs comes to mind for me. It is a book of instruction and preparation found in the biblical wisdom literature. Some would say it is like a manual passed from parent to child or one person to another, telling it like it is, but a little slant enough that the brain has to work out the puzzle, learning critical thinking along the way. This human organ that we associate with knowledge is to be exercised and used. Wilbur knew this. In doing so, the knowledge within expands and the wisdom gained can be utilized for the good of all. I only knew Wilbur for 4 years. I met him in a seated circle outside on a Timbercrest lawn. It was July 2020, and we were all masked as everyone went around the circle introducing themselves to me. I could only see them from the bridge of the nose up, so I was learning eyeballs in people. My heart swelled in these circles as I watched longtime friends remembering tidbits from other people's lives that they would make sure got told, and how much fun they had in those connections. Wilbur listened well in the circle, engaged and attentive, and when it was his turn, that light blue paper mask could barely stay on his face, slipping down to his chin over and over, and he would lift it back up and then it would slip down. I don't know if it was the exuberance of telling his introductory story or just a mismatch of mask and personality. He took the masking protocol very seriously, but there was no masking that big, prominent, mischievous, well-lived personality. When Timbercrest was open again for visits, he eagerly restarted his coffee and dessert visits. We shared a deep love for the ritual of coffee served in brightly colored cups, and later shared a moment of sadness when he made the decision to remain in healthcare, where his coffee maker would not be joining him. I learned that to end a pastoral visit with Wilbur, we would not be holding hands in a moment of loving prayer, as I do and enjoy with so many. Instead, we would end eyes to smiling eyes, with words of affirmation and appreciation for one another and for the ideas that we had touched on. One might call that a prayer. For Wilbur, the eye-to-eye contact, the warmth of appreciation and clasp of hands served a deep and abiding human connection. So theology and science and human behavior, mechanical or electrical know-how or not know-how, were perhaps common ground starting places with others for a wide and wonder-filled view of all that is known, that is in the process of being known, and that we have yet to know. This wonder, this seeking, Wilbur lived out in the solitude of his rooms and burst into companionable conversation wherever he was. He couldn't help it. He couldn't keep what he was learning and thinking and enjoying to himself. One Sunday, as the congregation was standing to leave after the postlude, he burst into the aisle right over there, and I thought he was going to explode with energy. It had been a worship service led by the children and the young adults. He eagerly, with his walker and in his gray Sunday suit, made his way upstream while everyone else was going that way. And he was moving toward those young people, saying out loud, This was just great. This was so important. They are the future of the church. We must do this again. It was not a saccharine or a sentimental declaration. His vision was ever forward, whether it was church or science or medicine or world events. He was learning and celebrating from the youngest to the oldest. Longtime friend David Waz shares this. Our weekly get-togethers had a full range of topics, fed by his ever-active curiosities about books, science, theology, history, an endless list. For a time, we joined forces to lead discussions in Questers, but those discussions knew no end, over lunch or coffee, always stimulating. Questers is a decades-long running class that follows worship each Sunday here at the church, a gathering of those willing to poke and punch holes in accepted doctrine and to explore the reaches of ideas that make many people uncomfortable. This was Wilbur's hour, along with good friends and curious thinkers, up until the most recent time when he was no longer mobile in a way that allowed him to physically come to church. Jeanette Lehman, one of those questers, speaks of how Wilbur was invested in continuing to keep searching. He engaged conversation to think again about something in a new way. Joanne Schall, also a fellow quester, reflected on his centrality to discussions on Sunday and the way he organized the Shepherd Center Med Talks, which we've already heard about, inviting area medical specialists. She said, he seemed to know and have the respect of many physicians. It was quite an achievement to be able to draw them away from their busy practices for a 1-hour interview in North Manchester. Attendance was always high on mornings when Wilbur brought us Med Talk. And she continues to say, I also remember him as a caring human. My daughter, Janine, was his patient as a child. And when he heard she was having a medical problem where she lived in South Texas just a year ago, he asked whether I could send him her medical report from a tissue analysis done at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He read the report and explained it to me. He also encouraged both of us by saying the treatment plan looked sound. His caring made a real difference for us. When the COVID pandemic hit, he became the Timbercrest residents' advocate. I wonder who appointed him to that. As Dave said, he was keeping up on all the information about COVID as new understanding and science came out, and he wrote weekly articles for the folks at Timbercrest. In the book, the compilation of those articles, it begins with the words, I have a morbid interest in epidemics, clearly biased by the science. And he advocated for the importance of isolation, for mask use, and for vaccines. He certainly spoke from a place of strong opinion, like the rest of the world, but his opinion was guided by his own vast medical, historical, sociological knowledge and what he was learning from the epidemiologists. He declared Timbercrest to be the safest place on earth during the pandemic and commended the tough decisions made for the well-being of all the residents. At the end of his book, he thanked science and those who made the decisions and those who followed the protocols and those who received the vaccine to the benefit of the whole community. In so many stories that family have shared throughout today and stories you hold as your own, there is a thread, a theme of commitment, tenacious commitment. This commitment embodied the partnership of mind and heart. He has been committed to the church, to the mission field, to family, to Joyce, to his practice, to the life of the mind and the bettering of humanity, and apparently lots of jokes. He was gifted with and positioned in a way to accomplish so much. I don't think he could help himself. He faced what he had to, and he did what was in him to do. Back to the book of Proverbs. The writer of Proverbs and Wilbur have much in common. A desire to question, to think, to know more, to live by an ethos of what serves the community best. Wisdom is personified in Proverbs in the feminine, and she is insistently calling all who would be wise to come to the windows, the doorways, and the street corners, to gather in, to lean in, listen, and learn. Wisdom calls us to these thresholds where if we dare cross over, we risk knowing more and differently than we ever knew possible. Wilbur crossed those thresholds repeatedly and changed himself, those around him, and the world for better. Wisdom in Proverbs is quite cheeky and bold of speech. Wisdom says, "For waywardness kills the simple, and the complacency of fools destroys them." And Wilbur says, "There's no cure for stupid." Wisdom in Proverbs is quite clear about the importance to keep seeking and learning what is noble, just, and right. Wisdom says, "I, wisdom, live with prudence, and I attain knowledge and discretion. I have good advice and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength." And Wilbur says, critical thinking takes time to develop and practice. Wilbur trusted that this life was enough. Life right now is rich and full of more to explore. He was not motivated by heaven or an afterlife, an understanding that the writer of Proverbs would also have shared with him. Wilbur found deep meaning and joy in life by leaning into what he could see and touch, test, and critically analyze. He did so with a fervor of care and compassion, good humor, commitment, and love. The communities that he was a part of all over the world and through his entire life are better because of his tenacious commitment and his ardent spirit. Our faith and the way we understand things will sustain us in the loss of this great and dear human. Our love for Wilbur will keep us tender and guide us toward compassion as grief finds a place settled within us. Wilbur has been our doctor and teacher, friend and father. And now his journey is within each of us. Thank you, Wilbur, for being our guide. And thanks be to God. Family and friends, learn and love all the days of your living. Serve and commit to what is worthy. Round yourselves into conversations that lead to connection and growth. And may God be with you, be with us all. Amen. Please be seated. you.